Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to see such a great crowd here at the Millyard Museum. My name is Jeff Barraclough. I'm the Executive Director of the Manchester Historic Association and Millyard Museum. So thank you all for coming out here this morning for what will be, I'm sure, a great talk and lecture about Pine Island Park. Just a quick word about who we are for those of you who are not familiar, who have never been here before. The Manchester Historic Association is an organization founded in 1896 to collect, preserve, and share Manchester's history. And we do that through a variety of ways throughout the year. We do that through the Millyard Museum, where we have people come in to look at rotating exhibits. We have children's programs, school groups that come through. We also operate our research center at 129 Amherst Street, where people can go in and do research on their families, on their properties, and that is where our collection of archives and historical objects are held. We also do programs and events throughout the year, such as this one this morning on Pine Island Park. And I just want to announce a few upcoming events for you to put on your calendar if you are interested. Coming up in April, on Wednesday, April 16th, that will be our annual meeting where we will elect new board members, but also we'll be having our exhibit opening of our next exhibit, which will be right behind this screen, and it will be called All Bottled Up, The History of Bottling in Manchester. So we have a large collection of glass bottles and bottles from liquor bottlers and soda and milk and dairy products and apothecary bottles. So it'll be a really fun exhibit looking at the history of bottling in Manchester. Following that event, and that exhibit will be up for a few months throughout the summer, on April 24th, which is a Thursday evening, we'll be having a special program here called World War II Letters from Home. We'll be having dramatic readings of a collection of diary entries from a Manchester woman named Isabel Morse. And these diaries were recently donated to the Historic Association in our collection. Really a fascinating look at what life was like at home from the perspective of a Manchester woman whose son was fighting overseas. So that should be a really fun and enjoyable program as well. And then on April 20th is our Historic Preservation Awards. This is our annual event where we celebrate those in the community who have worked hard to preserve their properties, their homes, their businesses, and that will be held at the Derryfield School this year on May 20th. We are selling tickets for that event and accepting sponsors as well. So please put all of those on your calendar. It is now my pleasure to introduce Ed Brouder. Ed Brouder is a Manchester historian. I'm sure many of you know who he is. He works tirelessly researching and helping people do research at our research center on Amherst Street. He's also a radio personality. You probably recognize his voice from listening to Manchester radio over the years. And he is a trustee emeritus of the Historic Association, former past president. So please help me welcome Ed Brouder.
Well, maybe we should have had this at the Civic Center today. Thank you all for coming out. We really appreciate it. First, a couple of housekeeping notes. If anybody lost a silver earring in the parking lot, that's where it was found. We'll keep it up here at the podium, and you can come claim it later on. Also, emergency exits, because we are kind of full today. The main entrance that you came in on, you could also, in a real emergency, go out the door that's right to the left of the sundial shoe sign. And in a real emergency, you could go down this hall, and there's an emergency exit at the end of this. Restrooms, out the main entrance and just beyond the elevator on your left. Any questions? Good. Well, the inspiration for today's talk came from this book, and many of you saw John Jordan, the author who wrote this book, out at the front signing copies today. John wrote this, and it was published about Labor Day of last year, and he ran into a period of poor health and was not able to do any function at that time to get this kicked off. So in the meantime, we thought, well, it would be good if maybe in the spring we could do an actual presentation on Pine Island Park. So that's where the idea was born, and that's where today's presentation comes from. We're very grateful for the financial support of the Airport Diner at 2280 Brown Avenue in Manchester, part of the Common Man family of New Hampshire, for underwriting today's presentation. They have some mini menus out on the front table near where John's books are, if you'd like to see what they do. So, what are we talking about? Where was Pine Island Park? And a station was laid out for the Manchester Nashua Street Railway at the Cohos Junction, which is in Goss Falls. Well, in 1892, the street railway bought 2.6 acres near Lake Massabesic for a 2-story pavilion. They built a penny arcade and refreshment stands. And that was it. Why do you suppose they went to Lake Massabesic? Because it had a big lake there for recreation. In those days, you could swim in Massabesic. You can't, of course, today, although some boating is still allowed. But it was a destination. Even though it doesn't seem like it's very far out of town today, that was like taking a major trip in those days. So J. Brodie Smith had the idea of extending a trolley line out towards Lake Massabesic. The company invested in building these pavilions to provide entertainment, and a new venue was born, a destination venue. In fact, it proved so popular that soon there was a 2nd-story dance hall added to the facility. And in fact, the attraction was so successful, the street railway even added extra cars from downtown to Massabesic on weekends. By 1899, they'd added a summer theater, and the summer theater, which you'll see here, had seating for 900 people. So this was a pretty big venue. The problem was they sold liquor here, and it caused a lot of problems. Muggings, holdups, pickpockets, fistfights. And one of the newspapers of the day ran this editorial cartoon captioned "A Quiet Sunday at the Lake." It got a real reputation of being not a place to take your family. And the police were always down there, especially at night when dances were underway, for dealing with the unseemly behavior which occurred in the darkened dance hall. So J. Brodie Smith started thinking, well, maybe there's a way to get around this. Let's talk about Goff's Falls, the whole neighborhood. This is a map. It's actually an excerpt from a map we have hanging at the Research Center on Amherst Street. This was published in 1870. And the area in particular that we're looking at is right down in this corner. You see a hashed line that runs left to right. This is the border with Londonderry and Manchester. You see this is called Derry Mills. It was also known as Devonshire Mills. You also see what today would be considered Brown Avenue running north to south. And of course, here's the Merrimack River. There was a couple of very elementary roads that went up here. They weren't much more than dirt roads because most of the traffic was horse-drawn buggies. Now I'm going to show you the same area, but tilted on its side. This was 22 years later in 1892. And you see Goff's Falls is the label. The river now is down here on the bottom. You see the Concord and Montreal Railroad line, which ran down through here, the Goff's Falls Railroad Station. Up here, the Manchester and Lawrence Railroad, which runs right through the middle of the Manchester Airport property today, though the track has long since been removed. What do you not see here? You don't see a pond at Goff's Falls, at Pine Island, because it hadn't been dammed up yet. The Great Cohos Brook actually drained east to west into the Merrimack River, and that's kind of an unusual configuration. But Lake Massabesic is drained through the Great Cohos Brook into the Merrimack. And it was Manchester Waterworks who first dammed up the works, if you'll pardon the pun, right over here by installing a dam. They did this in 1894 and immediately were sued by the Devonshire Mills because they said, you've just cut off power or control over the water power that runs our textile mill. So it lingered in the courts for a while, but eventually they collected $57,000 from the city, which in 1894 was pretty big money. So the water was dammed up to create Pine Island Pond. This is what the dam looked like. And of course, Devonshire Mills was able to get a settlement and was able to continue operating from, this is one of their main buildings. Natural Falls channeled the water from there through the mills down into the Merrimack River. So what was the journey like from downtown Manchester to Goff's Falls in those days? Well, it was very rural, and the trip to City Hall took about 18 minutes. From right in front of City Hall, there was a stop to get down to this area. This is Brown Avenue. And you see there was a double track for the trolleys here, one coming, one going. And some of you will probably recognize the name at the bottom. This postcard was made specifically for the J.B. Varick department store in Manchester. When you got to Goff's Falls, there wasn't a lot there. It was kind of a picturesque but very sleepy little village with a very small population. This shot is looking south towards Litchfield or Londonderry. So again, this would have been Brown Avenue. What was in Goff's Falls was the Elms. The Elms was a popular resort hotel, but originally it started as a boarding house for people who worked at Devonshire Mills. And the family that ran it was there for many years, and the Elms was located a little farther north in later years, and it became the Highlander Inn and property which a lot of people used to go to for outings. But here you see the Merrimack River would be right here, north to south. They call it Califf Road here, but really that was Califf Road merging with what was Brown Avenue, coming right through the village. And you see the Manchester Dairy streetcar line, and that would have been Willow Street. So this is not exactly drawn to dimension, but this was a publicity map the Elms used for potential visitors. That was the big attraction in town until June 10th, 1901, when the first trolley car was run from downtown to Goffs Falls. And that's what the trolleys looked like in those days. They were mostly open-sided, which was okay for most of the year because Pine Island Park was mostly a summer attraction. They did have some winter activities there, which we'll talk about. But for the most part, it was a summer event, so open-sided trolley cars was not a problem. So this shows some of the property that was taken by Manchester Traction Power and Light when they bought the land in order to start the park. This was drawn in 1840, but it's the estate of Nathaniel Moore. Nathaniel lived here, and his brother Ira lived next door, and the rest of this property on this map was all, including the widow's portion, was all for family members. It was all portioned out as people grew to the age of majority or got married and had their own families. They would be given a piece of the family land. You do see the Cohos Brook, although they're calling it the Cohos, C-O-H-O-S, here, and you get the idea that the dam has begun. So when Manchester Traction Power and Light bought the estate from Ira W. Moore, he was a Civil War veteran. He'd been a commander of a regiment in the old New Hampshire militia. He served time in the New Hampshire legislature from 1846. He was a farmer by trade. He and his brother lived next to each other. Their neighborhood was listed in city directories of the day as Moore's Village. Even though it was not a formal village like Goffs Falls, it was called Moore's Village. Ira Moore died in January 1892, and that's what set J. Brodie Smith thinking about, let's make a new destination for tourists at the south end of the city. Let's extend our trolley car line a little farther, make a new destination where alcohol will not be served, and it will be more of a family-oriented crowd that will be welcome. So on August 3rd of 1902, Pine Island Park opened on a total of 135 acres. A Manchester catering firm known as the Burke Brothers was given the exclusive franchise to provide refreshments. And in fact, I've got a couple of statistics about some of their first sales on that first weekend. The area that became the amusement park was actually originally known as Meadow Pond. And once Manchester Traction announced that it was creating the amusement park, they had to name it something because Meadow Pond Park didn't sound that great. So they got the newspapers in town. There were two at the time, the Leader and the Manchester Daily Mirror and American. They got the two papers to cooperate to run a contest that readers could submit suggestions for the name. And the winning entry was from a young lady named Bertha Carpenter who lived up in the North End on Manchester Street. She addressed her letter August 23rd, 1902 to J. Brodie Smith and said, "My dear sir, I would suggest Pine Island Park as a name for the pleasure ground at Goffs Falls. First, for the ease with which it is spoken and the euphonious sound." If anybody doesn't know what euphonious means, see Selman the Cash Hoffett. She's our president and a former English teacher. Second, taking each word separately, pine suggests the delightful, healthy odor of the trees. Island suggests water, boating, bathing, and their attendant pleasures. And park suggests outdoor sports. And third, it's a well-balanced title and easily adaptable for lettering and advertising purposes. So this was the winning selection. This was what the park became known as, Pine Island Park. And it opened its doors a little late for the season of 1902, but August 3rd was the very first day. About 36 acres had been laid out for waterfront rental cottages. The pond was about a mile long, give or take a bit. It's also worth noting that if you are familiar with the land, you know that the airport property, which abuts this area, is quite a bit higher in elevation than the pond itself. And that's significant because we'll show some overhead photos later on where you can't really see that there's a big drop-off in height, but there is a significant difference. So originally the park consisted of two islands, the North and South Island. They were both separated from the mainland, as it were, which was really just an isthmus of sorts. The South Island was pretty much used exclusively for picnics and was free of charge every day except Sunday and holidays when the biggest crowds would be there. The day after the park opened, the Union wrote, It is no secret that hundreds of people in this city have not visited Massabesic on a Sunday afternoon because of the reputation of the place. There has long been a desire that someplace might be opened where there would be nothing to attract people who wish to drink beer while they are enjoying their day of rest. Amen. There were some activities that took place at Pine Island Park in the winter. Ice skating was popular. There would be occasional exhibitions by the Brownies swimming group, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But there were other activities that took place from time to time in the winter, but it was primarily a summer park. May 10th of 1903, 5,000 people visited on the opening day for its first full season in 1903. M.T. Burke of the Burke Brothers said that his pavilion sold 15 gallons of ice cream. All 37 boats were used that day for rentals. Every streetcar in service in the city was pressed into use, running from downtown every 15 minutes all day long. May of 1906, the Traction Light and Power Company acquired all of the land north of Pine Island Park from the Harvey Mill on Mill Road to Brown Avenue. Now, Mill Road doesn't exist anymore, but you all probably know where the post office is on Goffs Falls Road. And if you go a little bit south of that, on your left, you'll be what they call the Instrument Landing System, the ILS equipment for the airport. Right where the ILS equipment was on the south side of the Cohos Brook, you can see the remnants of the bridge that used to be Mill Road, that used to cut from the current Goffs Falls Road to the perimeter road at the airport. They bought all of that land, and engineers surveyed it to lay out cottage lots. The company was determined to allow no liquor privileges in the park. The cottage lots will not be sold, but will be leased. So they're laying out a trolley line to get people to ride it, which they paid for. They're building an amusement park for people to enjoy after they've paid for their admission. And they're making cottages available that people can rent. So J. Brodie Smith was a very sharp businessman, an electric utility with 3 extra sources of revenue. In fact, J. Brodie was the very first person to sign up to get a cottage himself. Don't know if that's his wife or not. He was married. But you can imagine on a nice summer day spending some time out in that hammock, or that's their cottage from another view. They weren't grand cottages, but they were destinations, and they were away from the heat of the inner city. So there were very few amusement park rides during the first couple of years. It took a while to build up to that. But Pine Island Park was promoted primarily as a healthy place to walk and enjoy some time in nature. Water activities were big, swimming, boating, and so forth. To make the visits more memorable, fireworks were frequently advertised, and hot air balloon exhibitions were frequently advertised in those days as well. For example, August 25th of 1906, John Mahoney of Manchester climbed into the basket of a hot air balloon and threw lit firecrackers down to the onlookers. Then his balloon drifted north up along the Merrimack River on the Manchester and Lawrence Railroad track. When it ran out of gas and started to come down to the ground, he was almost run over by a freight train, but at the last second, he escaped unhurt. Can't say the same for his balloon, however. In August 1909, this chap, William Ulvin, took a bit in his mouth and hung as he was propelled 500 feet across the pond with this thing in his mouth. Stunts were big, and he did this for something like 9 years. So he was an annual attraction. Well, our collection at the Manchester Historic Association comprises not only what you see in this building, but we have a research center on Amherst Street, which houses lots of artifacts from the city's past. And our collection includes all the various blueprints of Pine Island Park that were donated by the Manchester Traction, Power, and Light to our collection. This one is from June 27, 1908. And if you notice the little loop down here at the bottom, that was where the trolleys came from. They came from the city, from downtown. I'm not sure which side they went up, but they went up in the loop, discharge passengers, and then they would go back around again to get back to the city. You see that some of the land has been bought from Devonshire Mills down here in 1902. This particular land was bought from a lady named Bessie White in 1902, so this would have been very near to the beginning of the park. That looks like land of Lewis Perrin. You see here the South Island, and you see part of the North Island over here, and most of the amusement rides and so forth were built up here as time went on. The park proved so popular that by 1907, after only 5 years in business, the Manchester and Derry streetcar railway line was inaugurated, a way to get even more people up from the southern parts of the state as far as Salem and parts of Massachusetts. Well, inevitably, having this much proximity to water and lots of people would create some problems. The first documented drowning was on July 6th of 1908. 17-year-old Arthur Gosselin drowned in just 10 feet of water. He apparently was unable to swim, and he had a life preserver with him, but it somehow got away from him, and down he went. July 26, 1909, 3 women were hurt when the veranda on the dancing pavilion collapsed suddenly. About 40 people fell into the water. They all sustained minor injuries, but there was nobody seriously hurt, no fatalities. But 6 weeks later, a one-armed man named George Busher fell 1,000 feet from a balloon into the pond when his parachute failed. He was advertised as a balloonist, and his attraction was he only had one arm. And he got up there in the balloon. He was wearing a parachute, and when he jumped from the balloon, it failed. And that was the end of George. Then July 29, 1910, a man, whoops, wait a minute, we're not quite there yet. Got to come back there. A manned dirigible crashed into the roller coaster. Now, balloonist Evan Parker was from Elmira, New York, and he jumped from what was called a Strobel dirigible. The Strobel chain sent people around the country to a lot of amusement parks, and their whole thing was attracting a crowd to see them jump out of this blimp, basically. And he jumped, he had to, because his balloon came into contact with the roller coaster, and that demolished the balloon, but he held on to the side till the fire department got there and rescued him, so Parker was not hurt. Now, let's all have a refreshing Moxie. How many are familiar with Moxie? How many have had it? And how many have had stomachs pumped? No. It's kind of an acquired taste. I say it's kind of akin to drinking hot gasoline, maybe. But it was a very popular drink, and in fact, it was originally bottled and distributed as a tonic for medicinal purposes. And that's what the bottles looked like in those days. Only later on did it become more of a soft drink as we would know it today. Well, in 1906, a 3-story tall bottle, or a building that looked like the bottle, was built in Coney Island, New York, for display at Coney Island, of course. It was built as a moving advertisement for the Moxie Nerve Food Company. And the idea was that they could move this thing around to different parts of the country, to different parks, but it was unwieldy because it was 3 stories high. So eventually it ran out of its time at Coney Island in 1910 and came to Manchester. It was moved on to Pine Island Park and stayed there for the next 10 years as an attraction that people could pay to go into and climb the 3 sets of stairs and look out and enjoy the view. So the bottle was at Pine Island for a total of 10 years. And this is what it looked like after it got moved across the pond to a private residence, the Todd family who lived on Pond Drive. And today this very bottle is on exhibit at the Matthews Museum of Maine Heritage. We have somebody here, Merrill Lewis, who is a prominent figure in the Moxie Congress of New England, who were responsible for getting the building and saving it here, taking it apart piece by piece and reassembling it in Maine. Well, from 1902, this is what it looked like when it was on Pond Drive, and it was no longer accessible to the public at this point. This was on private property. From 1902 to 1910, one of the popular recurring acts at the Pine Island Park was diving horses. Now, they probably didn't have the ASPCA in those days, or OSHA, or any of those, but they would coerce these horses to go up a platform, a portable platform that would be moved from park to park, and somehow at a given signal, the horse would plunge into the water. There was King, and of course the king has his queen. And this next shot is not a great shot, but because it is colorized, it's rare. It's got a lot of rust on the original negative, but you see the horse jumping into the water. And apparently the horses didn't mind this. They never had any incidents. And this again was a recurring feature for 8 years in the 1902 to 1910 period. Well, by 1912, the popularity of the park was growing, and the Chamber of Commerce decided to include an entire page of photos in its annual brochure. Now, these are all outdoor photos. They show scenic, bucolic views in the woods, the waterways, and so forth. They don't show any buildings. There were some by that time, but this was a publicity thing to get people to come to town. By this time, a management firm had been hired called the Graves and Ramsdell System of Hotels and Restaurants. This is their annual brochure. General Rufus Graves was from the seacoast, and he and his niece's husband, Charles Ramsdell, ran the company. And they were hired by various amusements around New England to run the place. At the time that they were involved running Pine Island Park, they also operated the Hampton Beach Casino, Ocean House and Cottages, Canopy Lake Park, Highland Park, and the Cape Cottage Casino in Maine. And they had a manager named M.F. Williams who ran the local operation in Manchester for them. Another interesting thing that happened in the early days of Pine Island Park was an annual trip for underprivileged kids. Now, Joseph A. Brown had been a Manchester alderman. He was a prominent businessman who was very successful, and when he died in 1908, he left $1,000 in his will to transport underprivileged kids to Pine Island for a day in the park every summer. And here you see the special trolley getting ready to leave Elm Street in 1912, right in front of City Hall. The next couple of shots are the procession in 1913, and this just wasn't one trolley car. This was a whole procession of trolley cars. And after the original $1,000 had been expended, people in town thought it was such a great idea that business people contributed to a fund to keep it going for several more years. And you see their arrival. And I like this shot in particular because this shows the road that would be going up. This would be Goffs Falls Road in the foreground. And you get the idea that this was all still pretty basic land at that point. Well, here's what things looked like during the 1915 Joseph A. Brown outing. Look at the mob of kids. There are several shots here. This is probably waiting in line for the bathrooms. Actually, that was the original Carousel building. They would bring down the school from the industrial school band, the YDC we would know it today, or the Sununu Youth Services building. And of course, water activities were always big. The 19-teens were a time of great growth for Pine Island Park. This blueprint is from August of 1918. You see the list of buildings that had been built, and you see their locations, and I realize it would be very difficult to read this in any detail. But this is the North Island here. That's the South Island. And most of the activity was up here. This would become a parking lot. This was the trolley station where people would arrive from. And of course, down there, this is Brown Avenue. Things weren't all rosy in the 19-teens, however. On July 2nd, 1913, a young lady named Eva LeMay of Manchester accepted an offer from a stranger for a canoe ride on the pond. She said the man placed a bottle of queer-smelling contents under her nose, and she went blank. She awoke on a float surrounded by people. Missing were her gold watch, gold bracelet, and $5. The bracelet was later found in a canoe, but the culprit was never found. That was July 2nd of 1913. On August 24th, a young lady named Grace Armstrong, age 32, went out on a canoe with her niece, Alice. They also were joined in the canoe by her friend Edward Hughes, age 30. The canoe got tipped. They all three went into the drink. Only Grace survived. She was rescued by onlookers, but the others did not make it. On July 4th, 1916, Reinhold Thomblum was stabbed to death at Pine Island Park. A well-known local pugilist, a boxer named Peter St. Denis, was arrested 8 days later, and he was eventually convicted of manslaughter and did time for the murder. In 1917, Pine Island Park signed a lease with Louis Birney of New York City to operate the Philadelphia Toboggan Carousel No. 1, in other words, the merry-go-round, popular at any amusement park. But then, the first of many fires. June 24th, 1923, the pavilion first used for roller skating and later for dancing was destroyed by fire on the South Island. Soon it was rebuilt as the Venetian Gardens. The canoe and boathouses were also destroyed in this fire and rebuilt on the North Island. The total loss was about $25,000, including 8 of their boats and some 60 to 80 canoes. Now, what was significant about this was Fernando's Havana Orchestra. I would be surprised if anybody in this crowd ever was entertained by the Fernando Band, but was anybody? There you go. Lieutenant. Yes, he did. He played at the Palace quite a bit. Lieutenant Felix Fernando was a World War I veteran, and his brothers, Angelo, Vincent, Victor, and Louis, were all part of the band. And they played all over the country. This was what he looked like, and this is an ad for them appearing back at the park after their pavilion had been rebuilt. They invested their own money to build the pavilion in their hometown, and they performed there most of every summer. The fire in 1923 caused a total loss of $7,800 just to the band. All of their instruments were destroyed, including a $1,000 piano. But they came back. Maestro? And there he is. Well, August 1924, another problem. An axle broke on their brand new Honeymoon Express Ferris wheel. Basically what happened was the Ferris wheel fell off its hinges and came to rest against those tall pine trees. It didn't fall over it. It was leaning against them. The wheel was held upright by those trees until volunteers and fire department rescuers got to them. The wheel was owned by a gentleman named Brodie Williams, whose name would become synonymous with the park for many decades. By 1926, in fact, Brodie was the lessee of the entire park. He stayed there for about 30 years. They got the Ferris wheel fixed, of course. He maintained an office downtown during the off-season on Chestnut Street. June of 1925, a gentleman named Francois LeBlanc died, 22-year-old man. He and a companion were out in a canoe for the first time. They tried to shift positions, and of course canoes are very rocky. It went over, and they both went into the drink. His companion lived, but LeBlanc did not. That was June 28th. On August 10th, same year, Irene Melanson and Chester Breslin of Massachusetts drowned. Irene had been spending her vacation at the nearby Elms Resort. Met her friend, they went into the water, that was a problem. March 18th of 1926, the Hillsborough County jury awarded Catherine Freer of Schenectady, New York, $25,000 in connection with the 1924 Ferris wheel collapse. The defendants were the Manchester Traction Light and Power Company, the Manchester Street Railway Company, and Brodie Williams, the amusement center's lessee. Well, all of a sudden in 1928, J. Brodie Smith announced that he was going to build a radio station, and he actually obtained a federal license from the then Federal Radio Commission. And the plan was, of course, they needed some towers from which to broadcast. They needed antenna, and his plan was to put 2 steel antenna 200 feet in the air at Pine Island. However, the federal government revoked the license because they didn't get this all installed within the license period, so the station never became a reality. But he was thinking about it. August 7th, 1928, 6 Chinese people from Boston were arrested for opium possession. And if you read the articles from the press of the day, they were very racist, especially by today's standards. We would be very, very aware of that by reading them. But apparently these folks went into the bushes or into the pine trees where it was very thick with trees and very sparse with people, and had a good high going by the time the police got there. They were all convicted. June 28th, the Strobel airships come back. Now, Charles Strobel was from Toledo, Ohio, and he literally would go around the country with his various dirigibles and show them off at exhibitions and county fairs and so forth. You'll recall that his associate, Evan Parker, failed in his attempt in a Strobel airship in 1910. Well, now this is 1929, and things went better. But when you look at it, this is just a big bag of gas. And it's attached to a very thin framework, and that's the pilot right there. And very often after he would perform some sort of a stunt, he would then jump down to the ground if it was low enough, as part of the act. In this particular 1929 episode, things went well. In 1929, the Wildcat roller coaster was designed and built by the Philadelphia Toboggan Company. It featured 3 camelback hills, a curving drop, and 4 of what they called floater hills. In 1930, park manager Brodie Williams announced 2 new buildings would be built. One of them would be for a flying plane attraction, and also 2 acres of parking would be installed to accommodate 2,000 cars. So they were packing people in those days. I mentioned earlier the Manchester Brownies, and if you were here in January for the talk that we did on the Amoskeag Ledge, you probably are familiar with the Brownies. It was a group that went swimming year-round in the old Amoskeag Quarry. Well, by April 1930, the city of Manchester had kicked them out of that area because it was too dangerous. They didn't feel that the police could control the crowds, which often exceeded 15,000 people who would come attend their exhibitions 4 times a year. So the Brownies relocated to Pine Island Park. And you see several of the Brownies here. They have the swimming suits that have the circular emblem on them. There was a big letter M that they had, so that's mostly their members. These are members of the public coming to see them. We know that this is a winter exhibition because this is ice, and they have chopped out the hole in the ice into which they would dive, which is essentially what they did at the Amoskeag Ledge. This particular year, they were also playing board games on blocks of ice. This was April 1932. They had a winter carnival, and they crowned Miss Helen Flanders as Queen of the Carnival. And the other big attraction that day was Frank Provost, one of the Brownies, who dove 130 feet from a tower they built into the hole they had dug into the ice for open water, safely. The Brownies had a good safety record both at the Ledge and at Pine Island, and they operated total for about 14 years, and we never recorded any sort of a fatality or serious injury with their activities. But even that was not the last. Eventually, about 1934, they kind of disbanded and moved on from that area. Well, this blueprint is from May of 1936, and it shows the new parking area, which has been installed right here. This is also additional parking if needed. And you see that they've got more buildings than ever. They're expanding like crazy. North Island, South Island, all the major rides up here. The park itself was promoting itself as a healthy place to be in the outdoors, enjoy some time with Mother Nature, and have a picnic. And sometime in the late 1930s or early 40s, that South Island that you saw got filled in. It disappeared. So now, today, it's only one island, the North Island. Land around the south was filled in, so that no longer exists. Two disasters came that dealt a serious blow to the park in the late 1930s. In one, 1936, the Manchester Board of Health banned swimming. This activity was banned because of pollution in the water. And they said part of it was contributing to the fact that all these cottages had been built around the perimeter of the park, and sewers weren't what they are today, and a lot of discharge was going directly into the pond. Rainwater wasn't being treated at all in those days. So they banned swimming, and that was a major blow to people who used to go to the park for that purpose. Boating was still allowed, however. But the real damage came from the hurricane of 1938 in September. The roller coaster, Ferris wheel, and bathhouses were all damaged. A tree sliced through the roof of the dance hall. 3,000 pine trees were destroyed. The Portsmouth Herald wrote, practically every tree in the many groves that made up the park was blown down, and many of the buildings are virtually destroyed. The havoc wrought must be seen to be realized. Well, times were starting to change, and by 1940, the Manchester Street Railway system ran its last trolley car. These were all replaced with buses, motorized buses. There it was, headed to Pine Island Park. In 1940, Barney Williams announced the grand opening of the Pine Island Park-In Theater, featuring Jean Harlow and Hell's Angels, admission 25 cents. That was the ad for the very first show at the drive-in theater. The drive-in, incidentally, was located in an area that had been damaged by the hurricane of '38, and all that damage basically made space for another 400 vehicles. So they took advantage of it and built the drive-in theater. World War II, of course, was tough on many segments of society, but it didn't do a lot to hurt Pine Island Park. For one thing, Manchester industries were benefiting from wartime production, so they were ramping up with employment. And then there was the airport, Finger got anxious. You see the proximity of the pond itself, which is here. This is the isthmus that had most of the pavilions on it. This was what used to be the South Island, and that's the North Island up there. Here's the airport. This is the main runway today, runway 1735, which runs north to south, but it goes another mile and a half down into Londonderry today. This is runway 624, which also has been extended right down to about here. This was a third runway used by the military during World War II, which is no longer there. But this is the area that slopes off substantially. There are some private industries in here today, and they get a good view of the pond, but they're looking down at it. There was a problem, though. Good news, bad news. During the war years, a lot of servicemen who were assigned to Grenier Field and their families would go to the park on their day off. So that was the good news. But the bad news happened on May 31st, 1943, when Private Joseph Matthews, a soldier at Grenier, drowned in the pond. His body was returned to his family in Pigeon Creek, Alabama. Well, throughout these years, Pine Island was an endless promoter of everything you could think of. Every unusual attraction that they could book, they would. They offered all the major dance bands of the day. In this case, is this Tommy or Jimmy Dorsey? Jimmy Dorsey's band was there. You also see another ad for Duke Ellington coming to the park. On November 4th of 1946, Pine Island Park Company, Inc. filed for corporate status with the state of New Hampshire. But that was dissolved in 1957 because the company failed to pay its renewal dues. So late 50s, that was starting to be the beginning of the end for the park. August 4th of 1947, another canoe mishap. Edward Good and his friend Ollie Doughlin had come up from Massachusetts with the Panther Athletic Association, a group they belonged to, and they were having their annual outing. The two decided to go out in a canoe, having no previous experience, and you know what happened. They both drowned. September 2nd, 1948, Albert Benoit, age 23, fell from a moving roller coaster car. He sustained multiple internal injuries, although he did live. And in 1948, Barney Williams bought the entire remaining park from Public Service Company of New Hampshire. In January 1951, Williams then sold the company again, just 3 years later, to Dennis Collins of Medford, Mass. And his associates. Now, at the time, the estimated sale prices ranged from $30,000 to $50,000. Remember that number, $30,000 to $50,000. The park, the property being sold, had now been whittled down to just 31.5 acres when it originally had been 135. The rest had been sold off to private interest, and a lot of houses have been built, especially at the north end of the pond. Well, in August of 1951, the new Pine Island Park, as it was marketed, was taken over by a promoter named Harry Prince, who reported to the trade papers that he was doing big business. An aggressive marketing campaign was launched for Pine Island Park on Route 3A for a PIP of a good time. PIP, Pine Island Park. The park was always a popular attraction for business groups, including the town of Pennacook, which used to have an annual outing for its local kids every year. The kids would all gather at a local store in town, wait for the buses to arrive, and then they would climb on board and head to Manchester for an outing. This went on for years. I think we have, there we go, a variety of the rides that everybody enjoyed. The next shot is from May 25th of 1955. Pine Island Park was sold by Harry Prince to the Shea Theater Interest of Manchester, Gerald Shea, president. Now, what had the sale price been in 1951? $30,000 to $50,000. Now it's being sold for $200,000. What had changed? There's less land, there's less attractions, but the Shea Theater Interest basically were overpaying. They appointed Edward Fahey as their manager, and the park limped along for a couple more years. But in June 1955, after all the workers had gone home for the day, burglars broke into the park office. They cracked 2 safes and got away with $5,700. Pine Island Park tried very hard to market itself in various media and with various partners, including this ad and the next, and I know they're not very crisp to read, but this was promoting Norman's country-style bread, which was now the exclusive bread provider for all the franchises in the park. So if you're going to have a sandwich of any kind, probably for hot dog rolls, you were going to get it Norman's country-style bread. July 1957, buckaroos of all sizes were invited to a mammoth Western show featuring George Spurger, a genuine Texas cowboy who later opened the Arrow S Ranch up in Hanover, New Hampshire. Here are several shots from May of 1955. And again, some of these rides you may have been on. In fact, maybe some of these are you. But if you do spot yourself in one of the pictures, we're not giving refunds today, sorry. We're a nonprofit. Labor Day 1956, the Charles Woodbury family enjoyed a day at Pine Island Park. It's interesting, the dress of the ladies in particular, but even the dad wearing a necktie. People were getting pretty dressed up for those days. And their youngest enjoyed the time in front of a former horse-drawn fire engine. By 1961, park attendance was dropping, and Pine Island Park went back to its roots as a picnic destination. In September, the merry-go-round, Dodgems, Penny Arcade, and 3 adjoining buildings were all destroyed in another fire. This ad promoted the opening of what would have become Pine Island's last season. On September 3rd, 1962, they closed for the season and for good. They never reopened, although they intended to open in '63, but it didn't happen. It was announced on May 9th, 1963, just weeks before the opening Memorial Day weekend, that Bernard Hickey, the general manager of the Shea Theaters, said the park was unprofitable, therefore was closing permanently. That's May of '63. 2 months later, the Penny Arcade and skating rink were rebuilt after the 1961 fire, but they were destroyed again in another fire. Then another fire in 1965 destroyed the dance hall, which by that time had been vacant for 3 years. So this place was slowly burning to the ground. By 1970, so this is just an article on the fire itself. 1970, the Wildcat roller coaster was demolished, and not much happened after that for several years. There was brief consideration by the state of New Hampshire to turning the land into a state park, but with only 30 acres, or at that point it was up to 42 acres, it really wasn't big enough for a state park, so the state said no thanks. In 1974, Amoskeag Industries purchased those 42 acres from the state theater properties for $250,000, intending to do industrial development. And in fact, in February of 1976, the home insurance company bought the remaining acreage from the city to build a 4-story, 100,000 square foot building. The sale price was $395,000. The building would hold 600 workers, and the address would become known as 3000 Goffs Falls Road. By 1978, the 4-H Educational Center operated on the pond's shore until it was destroyed by, guess what? Fire. This picture is the airport at the top. You see the pond is here. There's all these private houses that have been built. This is the building where home insurance, or the grounds where home insurance was built. This would be Brown Ave, the Merrimack River at the bottom, and I believe this would be the city's processing plant, the sewage plant, or perhaps it's this one, maybe both. And of course, 293 down here at the bottom. July 16, 1986, aldermen voted to purchase the pond itself, from developer Edward Sosha, who had tried to drain it in order to build housing on it. His thinking was this was all flat land originally, that the pond was an artificial, or the pond itself was artificial because it had been dammed. If we take the dam away, the water will drain. I've got flat land to build on. The city didn't let him. In June of 1992, Home Insurance sold the property to Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Hampshire, and Blue Cross began operating from its new headquarters on October 4th of 1993. But in 2013, they decided to move downtown to Elm Street office space, and they did so in 2014. The following month, Brady Sullivan Properties bought 3000 Goffs Falls Road for $5 million from a medical office properties trust in Massachusetts. So you can see the land was just being sold off and handed off from one property owner to the next. In 2018, the New Hampshire Business Finance Authority bought the land for $31 million and leased it to BAE Systems for a total of 10 years. BAE dedicated the plant on May 2nd of 2022 after it had been vacant for 3 years, and the ribbon cutting was held at 3000 Goffs Falls Road. Now, at this point, I would like to point out that there are 2 shirts that have been put together for the Manchester-related series of shirts that we have in our bookstore up front. And these 2 are both significant to Pine Island. One is the Pine Island Park and its final gate, and the Moxie Bottle House. Both of these shirts are available. They're $22 each on the Manchester Ink Link website, with a portion of the proceeds being donated back to the Manchester Historic Association. So I'll leave you with one final look at a montage of what this park was about. We have to have Uncle Gus. Pine Island Park, 1902 to 1962, RIP. Thank you all very much for coming today. We hope you'll stay and enjoy the museum if you haven't been here before. The best way is to come down around behind me, and it loops back and comes out this way. But please do enjoy the properties while you're here today. Sir?
What year did the drive-in close?
I don't know exactly what year. As I say, it opened in the mid-40s, but it was here after the park closed. It was after 1962 for probably another 5 or 6 years. Probably. We have a lot of records from the Shea Theater interest, but they're all theater-related from downtown as opposed to park-related. Monique?
The drive-in would have closed mid-70s.
Mid-1970s. Okay, so it stayed another 10 years perhaps.